Welcome back to the Bible Reading Challenge podcast. My name is Aaron Ventura, and in this episode, we're going to look at the book of Ezekiel. You can find a written version of this episode along with outlines for each book over at localchristendom.com. And if you have questions or other feedback, you can email me directly at aaronventura@gmail.com. The book of Ezekiel opens in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity, the summer of 593 BC. This was about 7 years before the fall of Jerusalem. By this time, Daniel had been serving in Nebuchadnezzar's court for about 10 years, and Jeremiah had already been prophesying for about 30 years. Ezekiel was likely a student of Jeremiah's back in Jerusalem along with Daniel, but had been taken off into exile in 597, along with men like Mordecai. The message to Israel at this time was to repent and submit to the yoke of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is God's servant and hammer to judge the whole world, and as a result, the land of Israel is going to be desolate for 70 years. Just as the Canaanites were kicked out of the promised land for their idolatry, so now Israel is being kicked out for living like Canaanites. In the first verse of Ezekiel, it says, "Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river Chebar, that the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God." We are told that these visions took place in the 30th year. And the question is, the 30th year of what? Calvin and other commentators take this as the 30th year in the Jubilee cycle. And since there are many other Jubilee themes in this book, I think that is a likely interpretation. Another option, and one that can harmonize with the Jubilee view, is that this is also the 30th year of Ezekiel's life. 30 was the age that priests entered the ministry. And in these opening chapters, God is going to anoint Ezekiel as a sort of high priest for the exile. The actual high priest back in Jerusalem was Sariah, but 7 years after this opening vision, Sariah will be executed by the king of Babylon. Ezekiel's name means God strengthens, or God shall prevail. And as with other prophets, Ezekiel's name signifies the message that God has for his people. He will be their strength. Despite being cast into the sea of exile and swallowed by the fish of Babylon, God will raise his people from the dead. He will breathe life into dry bones and resurrect the whole nation. Ezekiel's priestly and prophetic ministry runs for about 20 years. Just like the priests around the tabernacle, their work began at the age of 30, and they were required to stop at the age of 50. Similarly, Ezekiel's final vision of a new Holy Land and temple took place in his 50th year, the year of Jubilee. After that, we are not told anything else about him. One of the things you will notice as you read Ezekiel is that God calls him by the name Son of Man, or more literally, Son of Adam. This name will be picked up by the Lord Jesus in the Gospels as his favorite self-identification. But to understand who Jesus is as the Son of Man, we must first understand its Old Testament background. In Genesis, Adam was assigned the priestly duty of guarding and keeping God's garden sanctuary. This meant not allowing serpents and other troublemakers into it. This duty of protecting holy space was assigned to the tribe of Levi, and more specifically to the priests. The high priest was then a new son of Adam. He bore on his head the name of the Lord. His garments and gemstones represented God's people. He was himself a miniature version of the tabernacle. So by calling Ezekiel son of Adam, God is bestowing upon him certain priestly and prophetic duties. When Aaron and his sons were ordained to the ministry, they had to stand guard for 7 days without leaving the tabernacle lest they die. You can see this in Leviticus 8. On the 8th day, they were commanded to burn various sacrifices, and after this, the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. You can see that in Leviticus 9. We see a similar pattern in the opening chapters of Ezekiel. This new son of Adam sees the glory of the Lord. He sees the chariot throne, the 4 living creatures, wheels with eyes all around, fire and brightness and a rainbow. Ezekiel sees the heavenly reality of what the tabernacle and temple represented, and after he is given the Spirit, he sits astonished for 7 days. After this, his prophetic ministry begins. God says to him, "Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. Therefore, hear a word from my mouth and give them warning from me." When we think about the ministry of Jesus and compare him with Ezekiel, we can start to see the ways that Jesus is a new Adam, the ultimate Son of Man. Like Ezekiel, Jesus will be ordained by a river at the age of 30. He will be set as a watchman over Israel to warn them of coming judgment. He will prophesy of Jerusalem's destruction, but he will also, like Ezekiel, carry the blueprints for a new temple and a new city, but one that is built from his own flesh and blood. The Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. He comes as the Good Shepherd, the fulfillment of Ezekiel 34:11, which says, "For thus says the Lord God, indeed I myself will search for my sheep and seek them out." There are many other parallels between Ezekiel and Christ. So as you read this prophetic book, allow it to fill out what it means for Jesus to be a new Ezekiel, the God who strengthens, the Son of Man. Let's talk now about the literary structure of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is a very well-organized book. The first 24 chapters contain prophecies of judgment upon Israel. Chapters 25 to 32 are oracles against the foreign nations. Chapters 33 to 39 are prophecies of a future restoration. And then chapters 40 to 48 are a vision of a new temple and land. Now that is a content outline of the book, but the book can also be arranged into 7 distinct sections, where each section can be further divided into 7 more sections. And you can see this very detailed outline on the website. We might call this a Jubilee pattern, where 7 times 7 equals 49, and then you have the 50th year, the year of Jubilee. The 50th year was a holy year, a Sabbath of Sabbaths, in which every family was to return to their tribal land. Their debts were canceled, slaves were set free. And for a whole year, the land was to rest and God's people in it. Now in Ezekiel 48, which is the final chapter, we see a new division of the land with its tribal allotments. So both the structure and message of the book anticipate a future jubilee, when every family will return to the land and experience release from the bondage of exile that they were living in. This is ultimately fulfilled, of course, by the coming of Christ, who comes to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, Luke 4:19. So Jesus is the Jubilee that Ezekiel points to, both in its message and in its very literary structure. All right, well, let's look at each of these 7 sections and make a few comments about what is going on in each of them. So the first section is chapters 1 to 7, and this is the opening vision. And a lot of people have puzzled over what is happening here. It's quite strange and fantastic, and it stretches the limits of language and our own imagination. But we are told explicitly in verse 28 what we are seeing. It says, "This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord." So when we examine the details, the cherubim, the wheels, all this stuff, we find that this is the chariot throne of God. This is what was in the holy place in the tabernacle and the temple. So this is the heavenly substance of which the earthly tabernacle and sanctuary was a copy. As it says in Hebrews 9:23, "For Christ has not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us." So Ezekiel's vision is a glimpse of this heavenly glory, the fiery throne of God. This is an image that the book of Revelation will further unveil. In chapters 2 to 3, Ezekiel will be filled with the same spirit that animates this chariot throne. He will be a kind of 5th living creature of sorts that does exactly what God tells him to do. So in beholding God's glory, Ezekiel is transformed into a similar image. His face and forehead will become hard as adamant, like the metal of God's throne. He will be lifted up and taken to different places, just like the wheels. He will go in the heat of his spirit, just like the fire of God. After 7 days in astonishment, God sets Ezekiel as a watchman over the house of Israel. He is like a cherubim. His job will be to warn the wicked and the righteous of God's judgment. If he does not warn them, blood guilt will be upon his head. In chapters 4 to 7, we have the first of Ezekiel's prophetic sign acts, which are accompanied by oracles to explain them. He is told to build and portray in miniature form on a brick a siege against Jerusalem. He is to lay on his side for 390 days and then lay on his right side for 40 days, 1 day for each year of Israel and Judah's iniquity. This raises the difficult question of what is real and literal in Ezekiel's actions versus what was only visionary and then written down, and commentators differ on how to explain this. In favor of Ezekiel's actions being real-life events, we know that prophets are sometimes asked to do unusual and even miraculous things. Although it would be nearly impossible for Ezekiel to lay on his side for 430 days without moving, this is not totally beyond the realm of possibility, especially if he has the help of the Spirit. One commentator observes that there have been paralytics who have lain for as long as 16 years on one side, and this without a miracle. So is it so inconceivable that Ezekiel could not do the same? Against this being a real-life event, but rather something that is just visionary and then written down, we are told in chapter 8 that Ezekiel was, quote, sitting in his house among the elders, and that this was in the 6th year in the 6th month on the 5th day of the month. Now, if we calculate the difference in time between chapter 8 and chapter 4, which we are given, we find that this was only 406 days after Ezekiel was told to lie on his side, which would seem to contradict the 430 days he was supposed to have lain there. In response to this, some have posited an intercalary month, this is how you calculate time, to make up the difference, but this is uncertain. Another possibility is that Ezekiel carried out these actions but only for a portion of each day. So maybe this was his work day. He goes out, he performs the sign act, and then he goes home, and then he could sit in his house with the elders. So there are other possible solutions that we can think about here. However, if this was something he really did, it creates another problem that we need to solve, which is namely the lawfulness of these actions. Some have raised this moral question about the prophet being commanded to violate the law of God, which is something that would have discredited his message and undermined his status as a true prophet. So for example, Leviticus 19:27 says, "You shall not shave around the sides of your head, nor shall you disfigure the edges of your beard." And in Ezekiel 5, Ezekiel is told to do this very thing. The hair signifies God's people as they are cast into judgment. Likewise, Ezekiel is told to defile himself by eating bread that is cooked over human dung. This appears to violate Deuteronomy 14:3, which says, "You shall not eat any detestable thing," and Deuteronomy 23, which prescribes how human excrement is to be covered up outside the camp. You could see also Leviticus 5:3 and Leviticus 7:21. We might consider these exceptional circumstances and thus give Ezekiel a pass, since God is the one commanding these actions after all. But this is a real problem that we need to wrestle with and try to solve. According to Talmudic tradition, this tension between Ezekiel and the Torah would be explained only when Elijah came. Until then, that tension remained. So taking all of these arguments together, I personally lean towards seeing these as spiritual visions, not real-life actions. And this view is reinforced by some of the more obvious non-literal actions that Ezekiel does in these visions, such as eating the scroll and digging into the temple wall in chapter 8. Chapter 8 begins a new section that runs through chapter 13, in which the glory of God departs the temple. Ezekiel is taken by the tuft of his hair, so if he did shave his head, apparently his hair has grown back by now, and he is shown the abominations that are in the temple. This is the inspection of leprous houses that is described in Leviticus 14, where a priest examines the walls of the house and determines whether the plague has spread or not. If the walls are infected, then the house is torn down. In chapter 10, Ezekiel sees a man clothed in linen who scatters coals of fire over the city. We learn from Ezekiel 43:3 that this man in linen is Ezekiel. It says, "It was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when I came to destroy the city." So Ezekiel is seeing himself destroy Jerusalem. After this, God's glory departs, Ichabod, from Jerusalem. And then in chapter 11, God promises to be a sanctuary for the righteous. In chapter 12, Ezekiel is told to enact what will later happen to King Zedekiah when Babylon besieges them. He will dig through a wall thinking that he can escape, but then he will be caught in Babylon's snare. There is also a prophecy here of the king putting out Zedekiah's eyes. "I will bring him to Babylon, to the land of the Chaldeans, yet he shall not see it, though he shall die there." Ezekiel 12:13. Josephus records how Zedekiah's counselors played the prophet Ezekiel and the prophet Jeremiah off against each other, as if they contradicted. For it says in Jeremiah, "And you shall not escape from his hand, but shall surely be taken and delivered into his hand. Your eyes shall see the eyes of the king of Babylon. He shall speak with you face to face, and you shall go to Babylon." The question then is, how will Ezekiel see the king of Babylon but not see the land of Babylon? Well, if Nebuchadnezzar plucks his eyes out and then drags him off. In chapters 14 to 19, we have the promise of God's everlasting covenant. In Ezekiel 16, there is this extended discourse on Israel's harlotry. Israel has become more perverse than Sodom was when it was destroyed by fire. And yet, despite Israel's unfaithfulness, God remains faithful and promises, "Nevertheless, I will remember my covenant with you in the days of your youth, and I will establish an everlasting covenant with you." Although God has every right to divorce his people and put them to death for adultery, he will save them from their sins. In chapters 20 to 24, we have the death of the wife. God continues to detail the sins of Israel. He likens Jerusalem and Samaria to two harlot sisters who commit fornication with the nations. This section ends in chapter 24 with the death of Ezekiel's wife, and he is not even allowed to mourn. This is one of the reasons for regarding Ezekiel as God's high priest during the exile. In Leviticus 21, regular priests are allowed to mourn for their immediate family, but only the high priest was not allowed to mourn or defile himself for anyone. In chapters 25 to 32, we get oracles against 7 nations. In this section, Ezekiel pronounces judgment on Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, Sidon, and Egypt. The charge against them is pride and mocking at Jerusalem's fall. Because of their vengeful spirit, God will pour out his fury upon them. There is an extended oracle against the prince and king of Tyre in chapter 28, and this has generated a lot of speculation about who is being referred to. Some see this as an oracle against Satan or the Antichrist. Following James Jordan, my view is that the first 10 verses are against the prince of Tyre, and they are directed at the actual human ruler of Tyre at this time. But then in verses 11 to 19, which are addressed to the king of Tyre, these are directed at the spiritual ruler, which would have been the high priest back in Jerusalem. This explains why this king is called a cherub who is covered in precious stones. In chapters 29 to 32 are oracles against Egypt. God pronounces that they will be made desolate for 40 years, but then they will be gathered back into the land, kind of like Israel. Only this time, Egypt is going to be the lowliest of kingdoms. Egypt is going to be given as wages to Babylon for doing God's work for him. In chapters 33 to 39, we get promises of restoration. We have the famous Valley of Dry Bones that miraculously come to life in Ezekiel 37, and this is a prophecy of Israel's return to the land that takes place under Ezra and Nehemiah. During this time, Israel and Judah will also be reunited under a Davidic king. There will be a typological fulfillment of this in Zerubbabel, but of course, Jesus is the ultimate Davidic king who unites the people. In chapters 38 to 39, we have the famous battle of Gog and Magog. The burial place of these defeated foes is called the Valley of Haman Gog, and there is a connection here to the book of Esther. In Hebrew, Haman the Agagite and Haman Gog are very similar, and so I take the events of Esther as a typological fulfillment of this great battle. But there's also a final fulfillment at the end of history when Satan is released from his prison in Revelation 20, verse 7. Just prior to Christ's return, those who died in this battle of Gog and Magog receive their resurrection bodies and make a final attempt to destroy the saints. But fire comes down from God out of heaven and devours them, and then Satan is cast into the lake of fire. This is just one of many parallels between Ezekiel and the book of Revelation. It is right after this great battle that Ezekiel sees a vision of the new temple, our 7th and final section. And this parallels with Revelation 21 and 22, where John sees a new heaven and a new earth and the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. Well, let's talk about the New Jerusalem of Ezekiel. So this final section goes from chapter 40 to 48 and records the picture of a new temple and a new holy land. And this is a really difficult section to read and requires a lot of attention and imagination to even understand what is going on. Well, we are told in Ezekiel 43 verse 10 what the purpose is in God giving us this design. It says, "Son of man, describe the temple to the house of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities, and let them measure the pattern." Whatever lessons we are to learn from this section, the intended takeaway was to humble the Israelites living in exile. When God wants to teach us humility and holiness, he gives us heavenly architecture. This is worth reflecting on. Now, what exactly does this temple vision signify? Well, this is a picture of the restoration era. This started in Ezra and Nehemiah's day and ended with John the Baptist. One of the most striking images is in Ezekiel 47, where water flows from under the temple and out into the sea. This is an image of the Jews during the intertestamental period as they evangelized and set up synagogues throughout the earth. Jesus' first disciples are pictured as participating in this work, as they are fishers that Jesus is going to teach to become fishers of men. Now, some people have seen from these chapters a picture of the church age, or even of some third temple, some future millennial temple that's going to actually be literally built in Jerusalem. And I want to give you a few reasons why that is not what is being pictured here. First of all, in Ezekiel's vision, there are animal sacrifices that are said to make atonement. Well, we are told in Hebrews that Christ is the once for all sacrifice. So these sacrifices are not going to be reinstituted at some point in the future. At least they should not be. Secondly, in Ezekiel's vision, you have the observation of feasts. But we are told in Colossians 2:16 that Christ fulfilled and ended these. Third, in Ezekiel's vision, the ministerial priesthood is limited to Zadokites. But we are told in Hebrews that Christ is our Melchizedekian high priest, and he has made all of us priests and kings unto God, Revelation 5:10. Fourth, in Ezekiel's vision, the land is divided up by tribe, but we are told in the new covenant that Christ gives us the whole earth. We inherit all things. And then finally, in Ezekiel's vision, it forbids foreigners and those who are uncircumcised in their flesh from entering the sanctuary. But Jesus tore down this dividing wall of hostility and has granted full access to the Father. If we were to rebuild this temple and institute these ordinances again, we would be committing the grievous sin that Hebrews warns about. So will this temple ever be built? No. Israel was never even told to build this structure, but rather to keep its whole design and all its ordinances and perform them. Ezekiel 43:11. This is what Ezra and Nehemiah did. They established and rebuilt the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. Although what they built was not as externally glorious as what Ezekiel sees, the spiritual reality of it was still true. They reestablished sacrificial worship at this new temple and could take heart from the final words of Ezekiel, that the name of the city is called, the Lord is there. Well, that is the book of Ezekiel. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at aaronventura@gmail.com. I hope this helps you navigate what is indeed a very challenging book. All right, until next time, keep on reading.